On this channel, I tend to give examples of note-taking about things that I already really care about, and this is because I'm in a PhD and I got to choose the topic that I research. But what do you do if you're still doing coursework and you are forced to learn something that somebody else decided you should learn and write assignments on topics that you literally don't care about, but you still need to take notes and memorize that information? In this video, I want to share with you how I connect more deeply with my lecture notes regardless of the topic and my apparent interest in it. And this is part 2 of the previous video that I posted, but you don't need to have seen that one in order to get something out of this one. In that video, I shared how I take lecture notes, and it was based on a question I got from one of my Instagram followers. And to demonstrate how I take lecture notes, I used the software Obsidian. In this video, though, I'm going to use the note-taking software Scrintal to demonstrate how the different software can affect how your lecture notes look, and also because Scrintal is sponsoring this video. Thank you so much. So let's return to the question I received on Instagram that is driving these videos from Caro. In the second part of their message, Caro asked, "Do you have any idea how to make working in a natural sciencey zettelkasten more fun? Because the way you connect with your notes, with ideas and creativity really speaks to me, but I don't see a way I could do that when most of my notes are about types of rocks, or physical concepts, or summaries of papers. Do you have any ideas?" Well, yes, as it so happens, I have tons of ideas, and that is the topic of this video. So the whole goal of a zettelkasten is to deepen the connections between your various knowledges. When we make a connection with something, we become more invested in it and makes it more easily to remember and think creatively with that thing. When we connect with a piece of information, it becomes a part of our personal knowledge and gets so deeply integrated into the way that we think that we can't even imagine a time when we didn't know that thing. So when you're taking permanent notes for your zettelkasten, don't think about it as note-taking, because you are not taking notes. If you were taking notes, that's what we would call in the zettelkasten community fleeting notes, and it's what you do before something enters your zettelkasten as a permanent note. Once something enters your zettelkasten as a permanent note, it's because you've made a connection to it, and that connection is a literal connection within whatever note-taking software or paper and pen you use, but it's also hopefully an emotional connection through that literal connection. So some people call what we do in a zettelkasten note making instead of note taking. You can't just take somebody else's knowledge the way you can take information. Instead, you have to make personal knowledge for yourself. So my biggest recommendation to Caro is to make a connection to your notes, develop a relationship to them in the same way that you would with a person. How do you do that? Well, you find things in common with them, right? So I'm a theater scholar and maybe you're a natural sciences scholar. So we're a little bit different from each other, and I don't care about you right now, but I ask what movie you like, and it turns out your favorite movie is Burlesque with Christina Aguilera, which is also my favorite movie, and so we develop a connection. We've started the process of relationship building. So how can you do that better with your notes? Well, I'd like to show you using this video's sponsor, Scrintal. Scrintal is a visual note-taking tool that combines an infinite canvas with documents and the bidirectional linking necessary to form connections between your notes. Because it's browser-based, you can share Scrintal boards with others, making it great for team leaders, for students, researchers, educators. So if you're looking for a note-taking software that is maybe a bit more visually dynamic than the free options on the market, then you can try out Scrintal with my discount code below for 10% off a personal Pro subscription to Scrintal. Just use the code MorganJuly10 at checkout or the link in the description box, and you can get that discount. Plus, that is an affiliate link, so I'll get some kickback if you purchase Scrintal through my link at no extra cost to you. Caro asked me specifically about making more creative notes within a natural sciencey zettelkasten. Now, I'm not a natural sciences student, and so take everything I'm about to say with a grain of salt. And if you're looking for an actual representation of what a scientist would do with their zettelkasten, then I am not the channel to follow because my PhD is in theater and performance studies. But perhaps what my arts degrees might be good for in this case is finding interesting, creative connections between seemingly disparate pieces of knowledge, especially ones that are personal and can become a part of the story of ourselves. Really, I think that's a big part of what artists do and how they get inspired, is just forming connections between things in the world, just having a mind and an eye for the world that sees the connection points between things. And an artist is always working from their very personal, idiosyncratic perspective, and that's how I think that you should approach your zettelkasten as well. Treat your zettelkasten as a work of art, is what I'm trying to say, and here's how. What you're looking at right now in my Scrintal is a board, and I have called this board Class 100 Natural Science Lectures, just some generic pretend class name. And if I was taking notes on lectures in Scrintal as opposed to Obsidian, this might be how I would do it. I would create a board for the entire class, and then I would create notes for the individual lectures. So here is the note for the lecture that I was taking notes on. This is just a lecture that I found on YouTube. It was called How Continents Form. I figured I would literally use an example of rocks, since Caro specifically mentioned rocks in their message to me.
And I'm here to tell you about how the oldest continents formed.
So if this was a lecture at school, I would put my MLA formatting for the title of the lecture and its location and date and everything at the top of this card. And cards are what Scrintal calls notes. And then because this was YouTube, I literally copy and pasted the transcript from the YouTube video. But if this was a class lecture, then you might just be taking notes as the professor speaks. Once my transcript was in this note, I read back through it and tried to pull out points that I thought might be important if I was trying to regurgitate the information from this lecture later. And for every piece of information I thought might be important, I made a new card about it and I linked it to this main note. So for instance, my card on the continental crust, I put a quote from the video on there. I linked back to the video itself, so there's that link. And then in this case, I also started linking directly to other notes that specifically had to do with continental crusts. In this case, the idea that the continental crust erodes with time. So I've made my lecture note, and then I've made each of these kind of boring notes just about the literal information that was given to me by the lecturer. And those are permanent notes because they link to the original lecture, but to really make a note super permanent, we have to form more connections to it. So let's get to know these ideas and see where we can find some connection points between me and my life and cratons or the continental crust. Since I've already brought up the continental crust, let's go down into this idea that the continental crust erodes with time. So I took this note writing that over time continental crust, and I've linked to continental crust, erodes and wears down. The rock that gets eroded gets carried out to sea by rivers, so a lot of it is lost. That means the earliest rock on Earth has been recycled already and is inaccessible to us. So we can't know much about the earliest continental crust from Earth's first 2 billion years. Okay, so I'm not a geology student, I'm not a geologist. This is not a piece of information that I, Morgan, personally need to know. And again, I'm not a geologist, so this information might not be entirely accurate. But what I did find interesting about this that does link to things that I'm interested in is that it suggests our knowing is never finished and that there are some things in the world that we will never know. And this note, knowing is never finished, is something that was already inside my zettelkasten. It's been there for a while, and I got this idea from a totally different source. So now I've built quite a deep connection. Erosion of the continental crust is actually a really good example of this note that I already had about knowledge. And then I also created a new note to try to tie up some loose ends in my zettelkasten between continental crust erosion and the idea that knowing is never finished. So I created this note called There Are Some Things We Will Never Know. And I wrote, although knowing is never finished, there are some things we will not and cannot ever know because they've simply been lost. And if I scroll down, I can see that there's a backlink to continental crust erodes with time, but thinking about it now, I actually maybe want to make that link more explicit, so I'm going to type it out directly in the note. To add a connection in a card in Scrintal, you just type a plus sign and then start writing out the note you want to connect to or searching for something. And this little scroll bar search comes up down here, and I want to connect to continental crust erodes with time. So there's my example for that note. So that's a really basic version of how you form these deeper connections to the things that you're learning, and you can use pretty much any topic, like rocks, as an example for the thing that you're really interested in. I'm going to show you one other way I tried to make a creative connection between myself and my newfound information about rocks so that I could better remember the notion of cratons. Craton is not a term I had ever heard before listening to this YouTube lecture on cratons, and I'm pretty sure this lecture had been on a specific craton in the United States, but I'm in Ontario, Canada, so I was curious, what is a craton near me? So of course I took the note on cratons, I linked it to the idea that continental crust erodes with time and that there's some things I will never know, and I linked it back to the original one. And then this wasn't in the lecture, but I started searching for a craton near me so that I could make a personal connection to the idea of cratons. And I found out about the superior craton. So I'm going to click on that note, and I just pulled a quote from Wikipedia. Obviously, you can do deeper research than Wikipedia, but for the sake of example, the superior craton covers central Canada and occupies northern and central part of Quebec, extending through southern Ontario, which is where I am. So I actually have personal experience with this craton. I've seen this craton because I used to do drives to Sudbury with my family, and along the highway to Sudbury, there would be these massive rocks on the side of the road, which I always thought was like so fascinating and beautiful and could never stop just staring out the window at these gorgeous rocks. So I made a note that this reminds me of family trips to Sudbury. And I created that connection. So here is those rocks on the side of the road. So anyway, I wrote down my thought that growing up, sometimes I'd drive to Sudbury. I don't remember Sudbury, but I do remember driving there because of these gorgeous rocks. And I wrote, you could see the drill holes. Didn't know the term drill holes before I started learning about the superior craton and the rocks along the highway to Sudbury, but they're called drill holes, and it is evidence of where explosives were used to destroy rocks for highways. And so I actually made a note about that because I find that so fascinating. So here's what the drill holes look like. These super straight semi-cylindrical lines down the rocks on the side of the highway. And then even though the original lecture that I was watching didn't mention explosives or drill holes, I did quote from the original lecture, and I wrote that knowing now that Archean cratons preserve an important record of crust formation and growth through Earth's history. So here's the thing that I learned directly from the lecture, just a piece of information that I'm trying to form a connection to. It makes me sad to think that we blew up so much of the superior craton for highways. These things are like the oldest things on Earth, and we can use them to learn so much about our history, and here we are just blowing them up so that we can form new history through them, which is kind of poetic in itself. But anyway, I continued to reflect on this in the moment and kept writing. I wrote, at some point, someone saw that rock formation as getting in the way of human culture rather than being a necessary part of humans' life on Earth that is shared with so many other beings. In the case of explosives used for highways, the human desire for mastery is destructive, quite directly. And I linked to a note that already existed in my zettelkasten on the human desire for mastery as destructive, which was an idea I got from the book Unthinking Mastery by Julietta Singh and connects to other things from Latour, etc. And then I wrote, I wonder if the highway builders imagined that humans are part of the environment, rather than the environment being an obstacle humans have to overcome. Would they have designed it differently? So a little bit of a tangent here, but there's a learning taxonomy called ICE, which stands for Ideas, Connections, Extensions. Ideas is literally just what you learned from the lecture. It's just that information. It is these yellow pieces of information that haven't been formed connections to yet. Connections are what we're talking about here. I'm forming connections between the lecture and other knowledge that I have, whether it's my memory or my past notes and experiences and readings that I've done. But in the ICE learning taxonomy, there's this third level of learning called extensions. And this is where you have these connections between existing things and you use those to springboard into coming up with your own ideas and your own critical thinking and questions about the world that you could then go on to answer. And so that's where I ended up getting to in this random note-taking session that I literally just did for the sake of this video because Caro mentioned rocks and I don't know anything about rocks, but already because of this process of writing down the information and then forming connections between it, I was able to get to that third level of learning, that extension point, where now I could write a pretty interesting creative nonfiction piece just about the concept of drill holes on my family trip to Sudbury. And I have a better understanding of the geological backdrop for those ideas because of this lecture that I watched. So no, I'm not interested in rocks necessarily, but I am interested in the way that human culture thinks about the environment, and that can be exemplified by using explosives to destroy these super old rocks to create highways, and having an understanding of geology would definitely help me tell that story. So I'm going to close these notes now and give you a little zoom out so that you can see again with context what my note-taking session looked like. I've got a board, which is where I'm storing all of my notes about the entire class. I've got a lecture note in pink at the top, and just the label that this is my week 2 lecture notes. And then underneath the pink note, I've got 5 yellow notes, which are the literal pieces of information that I had to learn from this lecture. But then down here, all these white notes are ideas that spawned from those lecture notes that don't have to do directly with the lecture notes, but the lecture notes helped me investigate. And then of course, each of these white notes also have like a bunch of links to things that aren't even on this board at all. They're just in other parts of my zettelkasten. So to go back to Kara's question then, they ask, do you have an idea of how to make working in a natural sciencey zettelkasten more fun? I think that making personal connections to your lecture content does make that lecture content more fun to learn about. Obviously, it takes more time and it's maybe more difficult, but learning should be challenging because if you aren't challenged, then you probably aren't learning. I hope, Caro, this gave you an example of how you can connect your notes with other ideas and with creativity. And as a final suggestion, I actually want to recommend that you read some creative nonfiction. So not necessarily what your natural science professors are assigning you in school, but stuff that other natural scientists have written for a popular audience and how they made connections between natural science and more creative or philosophical or personal concepts. For instance, one of the best nonfiction books I've ever read is called Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. Robin Wall Kimmerer is a botanist by education, but she uses her knowledge of botany to try to form a deeper connection to her indigenous ancestry. I also really loved the short and quiet book Sounds of a Wild Snail Eating by Elizabeth Tova Bailey. In this book, we do learn a lot about snails, but Bailey also tries to connect her newfound knowledge of the natural sciences to her own medical condition to try to grapple more deeply with that personal experience. If anybody else has other creative nonfiction book recommendations where a specific academic field that one person might find boring has been connected to something more deeply personal and creative, then please drop them in the comment section below, because reading how others have made these deeply artistic and personal and philosophical and metaphorical connections to their super niche knowledges can be a good way for you to prime your mind to make those connections within your own zettelkasten. Anyway, that's all for this video. Thank you so much to Scrintal for sponsoring. If you liked the workflow that I demonstrated to you here, then you can use my discount code in the description box below or the link to get 10% off of Scrintal Personal Pro subscription. Keep sending me questions in the comments here and through Instagram, and I'll see you in another video again soon. Bye, everybody.